Sir, ready? Hello once again. This is Ania Abasta from the Asia eHealth Information Network. Welcome to this month's special AeHIN Hour, where we will talk on various topics concerning technology for health and civil registration and vital statistics. This AeHIN Hour is a bit different from our regular sessions every second Wednesdays and fourth Fridays of the month, 3 p.m. Philippine time, because we are now broadcasting at 11 a.m. to accommodate our speaker from Canada, Dr. Richard Scott. Our topic for today is placing countries in charge of their eHealth destiny. We are broadcasting from the National Telehealth Center in the Philippines, Manila. Today is November 13, 3 o'clock a.m. in the Philippines, and we are very honored to have with us our speaker from the University of Calgary, Dr. Richard Scott. So before we start our session, a few announcements. Number one, we're now using Cisco WebEx as platform for this meeting. If you are encountering problems on your connection, please log out the session and rejoin the meeting room immediately. Your mic will be muted during the meeting. If you have questions, you can type it in the chat box located on the right panel of your screen. Click the raise your hand button if you want to raise your question directly to our speaker. And on my signal, I can unmute you so you can ask your question to our speaker. And after our meeting, do not forget to accomplish the evaluation survey of this AeHIN Hour. And once you accomplish it, we can send you more information, readings, and other resources on our topic today. And lastly, please stand by for a photo-taking session so we can document your virtual presence in this AeHIN Hour. So AeHIN is Asia eHealth Information Network. We are a group of professionals from 21 countries in South and Southeast Asia and now expanding. And what we do is we collaborate and share information with each other on topics on eHealth, health information systems, and civil registration and vital statistics that would be relevant in solving problems for countries on this concern. So if you are ready to participate, okay, I think my voice is very tough on Dr. Richard, and I hope this is better. If you're ready to participate, I'd like to dedicate 5 minutes at least of our time for introductions. So as I will unmute you, so please introduce yourself, your name, maybe your occupation and your country, and your expectations on this session. On my signal, I will unmute you so you will be ready to speak on your microphone. Okay, so let's start maybe with Dr. Fazila, who's very ready and who came very early in our session. So Dr. Fazila, go ahead.
I'm a Deputy Director in the Telehealth Division of Ministry of Health Malaysia, and I've been involved in eHealth for the last 20 years. So I'm hoping that I will learn a lot today from Richard. Thank you.
Aaliyah, have we lost you?
Hello.
Hello.
Here. So I think Dr. Shabir, could you have your introduction to
Aliyah, this is Dr. Marcelo.
Yes, sir.
I think because we have a lot of people participating, let's skip the voice introductions and go ahead with Dr. Scott's presentation because it's congesting the network.
Okay, sir.
We'll just have everyone introduce themselves by the chat window. May I request that for everyone, and then we can proceed with Dr. Richard Scott. But welcome everyone to the session. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Azin, for that suggestion. As it was mentioned, please have your introductions on our chat window located at the lower right of your screen. So that's it for our introduction. Let me just read a short welcome to Dr. Richard Scott and some introductions about him. So our speaker for the day is an associate professor in the Global eHealth Research and Training Program of the for Innovation in Health Technology, University of Calgary. He has over 30 years of research experience in healthcare, being also a medical laboratory technologist, biochemist, clinical chemist, clinical and forensic toxicologist, and now focuses on the role of eHealth in the globalization of healthcare and how it affects our regions locally. So without further ado, thank you very much for being with us this morning. I'm now giving the floor to our speaker, Dr. Richard Scott.
Thanks very much, Aliyah. Much appreciated. And good evening, everybody. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the issues that occur currently within the Philippines. We've been hearing a great deal on the news, obviously, both from the news generally and also from local Filipino groups here. So we wish you a speedy recovery, or as speedy as it can be, and believe me, our thoughts are with you. And not just, of course, for the Philippines, because the storm has indeed moved on, but for anybody who is in distress, we wish you well. The topic for this evening, and I hope you can hear me because Aliyah's voice has been fading in and out as I've been listening. The topic for this evening is basically talking about the need and the value for an eHealth strategy. And this can be applied, we're going to be talking in this case about countries, but it's equally applicable to healthcare facilities. The ideal would be that in actual fact, each healthcare facility is in alignment with a national strategy, which is in alignment with a regional strategy, which is in fact in alignment with a global eHealth strategy. Now that's obviously a wee bit much at this point in time, but nonetheless that's the kind of vision that I have, so that we will truly, at one point in time, and hopefully in a not too distant future, have true global eHealth. And global eHealth, its prime function will be to support global health. We actually published, as I think you already know, a paper recently in JMIR, and that's going to be the reference point, if you will, to this discussion. Before we move on to the next slide, one thing I want to emphasize is that in the 17 years, not as long as Dr. Fazula, but nonetheless, in my 17 years, 18 years working in eHealth, I have focused on developing countries and been quite saddened by the fact that development of any kind of strategy, despite the fact that we talk about having strategies in place and we talk about roadmaps in Europe and things of that nature, I've not yet really seen a document that in my mind fully demonstrates the thought and the process that I believe is deserving of an eHealth strategy. And the problem, of course, is if you don't have an eHealth strategy to which you can refer to and to which you can guide other people, then things just tend to happen in an ad hoc fashion and without any significant direction. So I hope at the end of today, at the end of this session, we will both have time for discussion, and also hopefully I will hear from you that I've convinced you that indeed there is still the need for both facility and country-specific eHealth strategies in order to guide the correct development and the correct investment in eHealth. So on the next slide here, thank you, the topics that I want to cover today are basically these. Very briefly talk a little bit about context and cost. Try to understand what do we focus on, because that's a major issue, of course. Describe a little bit about where we start. Talk a little bit about what strategy is, and then, of course, move on to the topic of the paper and briefly discuss and run over the eHealth strategy development framework that both Maurice and I wrote about earlier this year. So what about context and cost? In the paper, we actually pose this question: can we afford eHealth? And we take you back to the WHO's report for the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, and that was back in 2001. Even at that point in time, they said that the minimum that a country needed to spend in order to provide a basic healthcare package was $34 per capita per annum. Now, I'm sure I'm not an economist, but I'm sure that is now, I don't know, $50, $60, $70 in today's money. But when we look at what's happening elsewhere, and I've just given you a couple of examples here, compare that $34, or say, let's call it $50 now. Compare that to what the US spends. Per person, they spend, or spent in 2011, nearly $9,000. And in Canada, we spent nearly $6,000 per person. So there is a huge difference there. And one of the challenges that I often give to people is to think, one of the justifications for eHealth, particularly, for example, for eHealth records, is cost saving. In a country where you're spending perhaps $9,000 or $6,000 per person per year, maybe some cost savings are feasible. But I would ask you to question seriously and diligently whether or not cost savings are feasible in healthcare systems that spend much less than that, which is quite common for developing countries. Now, if you look at the money that Canada spent in 2011, the majority of that, around 70%, was from the public purse. In other words, the other 30% came out of people's pockets for various types of additional healthcare activities. But most of the funding was from the taxes that we pay to the Canadian government each year. Only about 3% or 2.7% is actually spent on technology. Most of it goes to salaries or to drugs, things of that nature. So if we consider 2.7% would be about $113 per year that we spend on technology. And only a part of that will in actual fact be on eHealth. A lot of it will be on additional technology that has become the mainstay of modern medicine. So if I come back to the amount of money that is spent by developing countries on their healthcare, if you consider, say, $10 to $35 per person per year, that's only 27 to 67 cents per person per year. So what kind of an eHealth system can you actually buy and maintain? I'm hearing some feedback there. I hope everybody can still hear. In the next slide, Aaliyah, can I move it on? Thank you. One thing that we do know, but we tend to forget, is that eHealth is very much an opportunity cost. So if we spend money on eHealth, then we are taking away from the amount of money that is available to spend on the usual kind of healthcare activities: immunization, sanitation, clean water, development of rural clinics, and healthcare provider salaries. And if that is the case, then we have to think very, very carefully about the investment that we make in eHealth. And the argument that I always put forward is that we must do it in a way that is sound, evidence-based, transparent, and defensible. And I think the latter is very much an issue that I have with current strategies or roadmaps that you see in other countries. I do not believe that the work has been done up front to make these, in actual fact, defensible documents. So, in the next slide, one of the things that we tend to focus on, and I've got to be careful here, I'm not against electronic health records, but I do challenge them. One of the things that we often focus on is development of an electronic health record. It's often the first thing that people will think of when they consider development of any form of e-health activity. And it's very easy to say, well, okay, what we need is an electronic health record. But behind that simple phrase, there are many, many other things that are required. And I've just listed a few here. You have to have a client registry. In other words, you have to be able to identify and to document and to record in the system each and every person in that country. You have to have a provider registry. In other words, each and every person who is going to provide care, be they a physician, a nurse, an allied healthcare professional, a community healthcare worker, all of those people need to be identified and in a separate provider registry. You will, in actual fact, also have to determine which of those people can have access to the electronic health record and under which circumstances. So there are policy and software considerations in the background. Most typical electronic health records also are associated with diagnostic imaging systems, drug information systems, and laboratory information systems. All of the type of things that when your doctor or your physician orders a test, then information is fed back into the record so that they or other healthcare professionals can have access. Not only do you need all of these things, but you have to design it in such a way that it is interoperable. And not just interoperable within itself, but interoperable with other healthcare software packages that physicians or others may have in order to be able to access and integrate or interact, with the electronic health record. All of this then has to be done in such a fashion that it is private and confidential. So basically then, if you're going to start with an electronic health record, you're starting at the peak of the complexity of the eHealth setting. It's a high risk and complex endeavor, yet this is typically where we start. On the next slide, I'm challenging here a few things. In Britain, in the UK, they, I think it's about 10 years ago now, began their Health in IT project. And it was lauded at the time as being the world's biggest experiment. Well, in 2011, it was basically canned. And as you see on the top left there, it says the NHS, the National Health Service, £11 billion IT project officially ditched. There were many, many problems that arose. But the question that I always have is, if you look underneath, is an eHealth record the right solution for developing countries? Even in one province of Canada called British Columbia, it's estimated that around about $220 million have been spent in capital costs by March 2013, earlier this year, and that for them, it's still not functional, by the way, the electronic health record in BC. But in order for them to carry on, it's going to cost about $30 million every year in annual operating costs. So there are fundamental issues when anybody determines that they are going to undertake an electronic health record project on a large scale, for example, for a country or a region. Now, I also have listed there generic problems. This is from a paper that we quote in our own paper, and it was talking about developing countries. And it was saying some generic problems that exist is there are, whenever a project like this is started, there are expectations of instant results. And the actual support that is needed is often underestimated and therefore does not come through. And there's a lack of knowledge and understanding, typically, by many policy and decision makers with regard to what exactly they are getting into. Now, on the next slide, just want to remind you, this is a diagram that I often use, and as you'll see in the top left-hand corner there, it's been changing over the years. I view eHealth is something that leads into global eHealth. Now that's only, although the term is used, it's really only a fiction in my mind, because as of yet, we do not do things in an organized and global fashion. But as I mentioned earlier on, the ultimate goal is to support global health, just simply using eHealth tools. But I'm wanting to remind you here that not just health informatics that you see in that ovoid in the bottom right-hand side, there are many other components of eHealth that we could look towards. So there's telehealth, sometimes incorrectly called telemedicine. Now, originally that began with video conferencing, but that is no longer the case. There are many, many ways in which you can do telehealth these days. Obviously, mHealth is one that comes to mind, as you see above. But mHealth is really just the same kind of technology, if you will, just using different devices, mobile devices. There's also e-commerce, because healthcare costs. It does not matter which country or what philosophy you use, whether it's insurance or whether or not it's a universal healthcare system, it always costs. And so e-commerce comes into this, another component. Then on the other side, there's e-learning. Very, very valuable. E-learning is well respected in its own right, but nonetheless we use a great deal of it within eHealth. Now, one of the new ones there is social media. We really still do not fully understand how this is going to function and how this may help or hinder healthcare, particularly on a global basis. We now have tremendous capability to connect with one another, as we are doing on WebEx this evening, across the globe. But we can also do this in an unofficial, if you will, non-health fashion through social media, and yet it can still have bearing on healthcare. For example, think of how the one flu epidemic was followed by social media one time. All they did was to monitor the comments that were made by people regarding having coughs and sniffling and sneezing, and they were able to predict where the next outbreak, if you will, of the flu was going to be. There are tremendous poorly understood opportunities in social media at this point in time. But anyway, all I want to emphasize here is there's more to eHealth than just health informatics. Now on the next slide, Aaliyah, are you there? I should be able to move these on myself, but I can't see how. Okay. Now, I've got a series of slides here. I think it's 3 or 4 that are coming up. And these talk about something called the GBD 2010 study. That is the Global Burden of Disease 2010 study. The results, in actual fact, were only brought out towards the end of last year, the beginning of this year. And I think this information should give us pause for thought. Here, what I'm showing on this slide is risk factors. Now, risk factors are basically indicating to us where the biggest, well, obviously the biggest risk is for our population. And you can see for the Philippines here, I've given the URL down below, but the greatest disease burden for the Philippines comes from dietary risk, tobacco smoking, and hypertension. So if we were to think about what could we do with eHealth, should we focus on the risk factors for a country? You can also, obviously you can see here as well in the actual histogram there, you can understand that although it says dietary risk, the greatest proportion of that risk is associated with cardio and respiratory diseases. Now, also I've mentioned there in children, 0 to 5 years of age, then childhood underweight is the major risk. And for the working population, if you will, 15 to 49, dietary risks still remain the primary risk factor. So that's one thing to consider. Do we focus on risk factors? On the next slide, however, I give a different view. Thanks. So here what we're doing is looking towards the future. This here talks about dailies, disability life years, disability adjusted life years. And it's talking about the percentage of change that has occurred in the last 20 years between 1990 and 2010, again for the Philippines. I've drawn a line arbitrarily going across the blue line there, just so we have 5 major issues to consider. The most profound, of course, is you can see a huge increase, greater than 200% in diabetes. So maybe if we were to implement some kind of an eHealth solution for the Philippines, we should focus on diabetes. Following behind diabetes, a far reduced rate of increase are chronic kidney disease, hypertension, cirrhosis of the liver, and then also interpersonal injury, interestingly enough. So is this giving us some indication as to what we ought to look at in terms of finding an eHealth solution for the Philippines? And then on the next slide, I'm taking a different kind of a view. Here what we have are the years lived with disability. So consider that, and obviously this is totally dwarfed by current circumstances, but ordinarily the disabilities that people live with are, it says, other non-communicable diseases, musculoskeletal diseases, a huge proportion of mental and behavioral disorders, some respiratory diseases, and then also HIV, AIDS, and TB. But you will also see, well, first of all, I should say that is currently what people, the burden of disease of people living in the Philippines. So are these the issues that we ought to find an eHealth solution for? Perhaps. But the other issue is maybe it depends upon the age of the population, because as you can see, the proportion of the impact of some of these diseases or some of these issues is different depending upon the age of the person. So we might ask ourselves then, if we're going to introduce an eHealth solution, are we going to focus on the working population? Are we going to focus on children? Are we going to focus on the aged? And it will depend upon the country, as I think I show in the next slide. Aaliyah, are you there?
Hello, Dr. Scott, still here. You need to speak.
Thank you. So what I'm showing here, you can see the Philippines in the middle at the bottom there. And I've just shown the different countries, and this is focusing on the disability adjusted life years that I showed earlier on. Pardon me, years, YLDs. And I've shown other countries. So I know there were some people who we were expecting from Nepal. So in the bottom right is the histogram from Nepal. Above that is Japan. Then we have Bangladesh. Then we have Canada in the top right. And then below that, we have India. But the point that I'm trying to make here is as you look at these histograms, although there may be some similarity, for example, between Japan and Canada, Japan is very much shifted towards the right because they have one of the oldest populations in the world. Canada is more evenly distributed, if you will. Interestingly, India is particularly evenly distributed, I think. But you'll see that the Philippines and also Nepal are shifted a little bit to the left. But the point that I'm trying to make is that's very well described, if you will, by the Global Burden of Disease study, is that the eHealth issues are very much obviously country specific. And so we have to look to what is happening in each country in great detail in order to determine what we might be able to do as far as eHealth is concerned. In the next slide, please. This is one of my concerns. Typically, what we will do is to emulate or adapt what other people have done. We think it's a quick and easy way to approach the problem. Unfortunately, we lose the context, the local context when we do this. We always then say we'll learn from bad experiences of others. Well, I'm not sure we necessarily do that. And first of all, or pardon me, the next of all, The bad experiences may only have been bad in their particular setting. It may not have relevance to your setting. The same thing goes with the good experiences that are reported. It may not be appropriate for your particular setting. So what I'm trying to argue here is that really each and every country and each and every facility, healthcare facility, needs to begin from the basics and take a very hard and detailed look at their own setting. So in the next slide, this is old. The WHO in 2006 were, from one of their documents, focused on the fact that what we have to do is to develop a framework of strategic plans and policies to lay the foundation for development. Now, they were talking their development as far as eHealth is concerned. But then also, more recently, this is from Ontario, a province in Canada, the Auditor General was quoted as saying, Ontario has spent more than $1 billion, most of it apparently now lost, in part because the province rushed into the program without a strategic plan. I have to tell you that although if I go to Canada Health Infoway, who is the major facilitator of eHealth within Canada, I would be extremely hard-pressed to show you one document that I could say, here is Canada's strategy for eHealth. I don't think it exists. I've not seen it. And I don't think Canada is alone in that regard. Other people will point to documents and say, well, yeah, collectively, that's our strategy. But it's not the kind of strategy that I believe we need, and certainly not developed in the appropriate fashion either. So let me then pursue this a little more. In the next slide, this is a ridiculously detailed diagram. I'm trying to write a paper currently on change management issues because we always focus on change management during integration, if you will, and that's not appropriate. In actual fact, we need different types of change management throughout the life cycle of any eHealth project. But what I'm trying to do here is to emphasize that there's a huge amount of work that has to go, beginning, in my opinion, or I should say in our opinion, with Maurice as well, with strategy on the left-hand side, because that will tell you where you want to go and why you want to go there. It will also tell you what eHealth options are available to you. Then you need, once you've decided on which options, you need to develop the architecture, make sure you've got the infrastructure and infrastructure in place. You then have to implement the actual solutions. You have to evaluate them and determine whether or not they are go or no go. And only then do you actually integrate it into the existing health system and actually address at that point in time the health needs that were originally identified. So it's a very complex situation. And my concern is that I think we have often rushed into it based upon those arguments I showed before, about emulating what other people do, and therefore it's ill thought through. We don't have a strategy, and therefore we don't do the right thing, and we waste an awful lot of time, effort, and money. In the next slide, here I want to start challenging us to think about where can we start. This is a very common diagram, and yet I don't think we pay any attention to this when it comes to eHealth. The ideal, of course, is that we will find a beautifully low-cost solution that has high impact. I will leave definition of high impact to each person because it will be different in your individual setting. It might be the largest proportion of the population. It might be the most severe or debilitating disease that occurs in your country. So high impact obviously is open a little bit to interpretation there, but the principle is clear. Low cost and high impact, we definitely want to invest in those kinds of eHealth solutions. If they are high impact and high cost, maybe it's still worthwhile. And this, I think, gets into politics, in actual fact, perhaps more than logic. But then, of course, if it's low cost and low impact, not interested, and we are particularly not interested if it's low impact and high cost. So I think we should take a very hard look at some of the eHealth applications that we're putting in place and decide which quadrant does it belong in? Is it an appropriate thing to be doing? On the next slide, I'm going to complicate things a little bit And here I'm going to say, well, of course, things are never that black and white or colored as they are in this particular diagram. And so you may have things with a medium impact. Well, okay, you'll see in our recommended approach that there's something called the importance of determining the importance, if you will, of the solutions. You have to make a decision where you're going to spend your money. And so there's always the need to have that kind of an approach that will determine for you whether or not it's a perhaps or doubtful if it's appropriate to actually invest. And in the next slide, I'm complicating things even more and just talking about the fact, well, okay, it's not just the impact and the cost. What about the complexity of what it is you want to introduce? If it's too complex, even if it's low cost, maybe it's not going to work. And so there's many, many issues. And it's this kind of thought process that I'm trying to encourage during the eHealth strategy development. So in the next slide, where do you start? Well, in the literature, there's probably three things in recent times that I can point you towards. First of all is the WHO ITU document. They call it a National eHealth Strategy Toolkit, but I'm sorry, whilst I can support some of the content, you don't actually come out at the end of it with an eHealth strategy, ironically. Some years back, Tom Jones wrote Developing an eHealth Strategy for the Commonwealth. And in there are, again, some good tools, some worksheets that you can actually use. But again, I'm concerned that it's not talking about the principles behind a strategy. And then just last year, or was it, no, pardon me, 2 years ago now, Kenya spent 2 years going through their own process and developed the Kenyan National eHealth Strategy for 2011 to 2017. Each of those documents do have good content, and I think it's important that you read them. On the next slide, however, I want to focus in on the issue of what exactly is strategy. So here we have, as I've emphasized before, where are you going and why do you need to go there? That, for me, is what strategy is all about. It's going to be a document that will describe and justify then what you are going to do and why you are going to do it. And it will guide everybody into the future for the implementation of the eHealth solutions that you determine during that process. And my argument, or the argument that Maurice and I put forward, is that a strategy is the foundation for sustainable eHealth implementation. Once everybody is on board, and that's a part of the process, and agrees to the strategy, it's your North Star or your Southern Cross. It's what guides you as you move forward. So in the next slide, just quickly talking here about some of the literature. There's a lot of misuse in terms of saying strategy or strategic. We throw that word around so very, very commonly. It's almost lost its sense, which is a shame. But it's also important to emphasize that strategy is quite different from policy. I'll emphasize this point again a little later on. But this diagram here talks about what types of strategy there might be in different settings. And so we have at the top the understandability of the environment, and I would argue now that we pretty well understand what eHealth can do. And on the left-hand side, it's the turbulence. In other words, how neophyte and developmental is it? Well, I would again argue that now we have fairly low turbulence. Yes, eHealth is always changing, but nonetheless, it's fairly stable. And so if you're looking for something that is best for an environment where there is low turbulence and high understandability, then you come out with strategic planning. And that was the basis, if you will, where we began. The next slide. Again, just to emphasize, things are not cast in stone. We all understand that things change. And so you will begin with an intended strategy. And as you go along, there will be various factors that influence what is going on. And it'll become a deliberate strategy until you end up with your ultimate strategy. Significantly changed and adjusted as the reality of the situation has become clear. But the important thing is once you have your ultimate strategy, oh, we're flashing around here. When you have your ultimate strategy, it's something that you should maintain and adhere to. Not rigidly, but nonetheless it should be very, very difficult to change. Only with extreme high quality evidence should you change it. Otherwise, you fall back into the situation where things are being done in an ad hoc manner. The next slide. So here's our eHealth strategy development process. And if you have read it, then you'll understand this quite easily. And I'm just going to go through it quickly and then hopefully call for some questions. So it begins with the evidence gathering and the situation assessment. So here is where we have the chance to actually truly understand, perhaps, for example, the global burden of disease study. What are the main problems that we have to face within our healthcare and within our country as far as health is concerned? And I think even that, just doing that, would adjust some of the eHealth applications that we tend to put in place. But that's where we start. So we really have a very, very solid understanding of the health needs. It's really a country-level health needs assessment, if you will. The second step is the holistic review. Now, on the next slide, I've tried to describe what this is. This came from, in actual fact, a book by Sachs in 2005. And all I've done is to take that and add a few things here, if you see them in red. The type of things that Sachs was talking about in his poverty trap there. But I've added physical geography. If you've got a country that is really plains, as opposed to extremely mountainous, then there are different technological solutions you need to apply. How about geopolitics? Depending upon whether or not, for example, in Canada, healthcare is delivered by the provinces and the territories, and they are responsible for that delivery. Yet, in actual fact, Health Canada, or the government of Canada, has influence, but not in terms of the delivery of healthcare. So there are all sorts of issues of that nature that have to be firmly understood, and the impact on eHealth estimated. There's a need for certain infrastructure, of course. Then if you look on the other side there, what I've done is to add ones that I think are relevant to the eHealth situation. And if you look at the third one down there, external factors, I've even thrown in here the projected impact on health of climate change. Now, I know that that is a bit of a interesting topic in itself. Some people believe, some people do not believe. But whether or not you believe it's man-made, there does seem to be sufficient evidence accruing that in actual fact the number of disasters that we are facing are increasing both in frequency and in impact. And so I think we have to begin to understand that this is something we will have to face and need to see how eHealth can help in that regard, and so therefore build it into our strategy as we move forward. So on the next slide, just going back to the list, differential diagnosis. Well, every physician is trained in that fashion, and all this means is a patient or a country, in this case, may appear with similar signs and symptoms, but in actual fact, they don't have the same disease. And so their management has to be treated differently. Same thing can be said for a country when it comes down to health needs. It may be that in one part of the country, something is profoundly important, whereas in other parts of the country, it is not. And so therefore, there will need to be a different approach in terms of understanding how to employ eHealth. Then comes the prioritization. We may now have some kind of an understanding of what are the major issues in different parts of the country and in the country overall, but we can't obviously address them all. So how do we prioritize these? And we describe some tools that can be used in actual fact to try to take the to make it less personal, so that the logical conclusion is identified rather than the emotional priority. Then identifying solutions. If I'll go on to the next slide here. The thing that I always ensure that people must understand, despite the fact, as Alvin knows, I am guilty of having described panacea, which was an eHealth activity in Asia for some years. eHealth is not a panacea. It's purely a facilitator. And eHealth is not always the answer to the problems that you're facing. So I would urge you to look at what the issues are and to identify the best solution. And that may not be eHealth. So in the next slide, back to the list again. At this point, it's only at this point, once you've understood what the situation is and identified potential solutions, that you even consider eHealth. So from the spectrum of technological options that we have, are there some eHealth solutions that might be able to address the health needs that we've identified? Then you go through a secondary prioritization step, and here I throw in sometimes, and we've created a design for this, a business case analysis. Because although you've got all of these eHealth solutions, some of them may be very expensive, some of them may in actual fact be too complex. So you have to, at this point in time, again prioritize and understand which of these eHealth solutions can be reasonably achieved at this point in time. And then if you add all of these steps, 1 through 7, step 8 is actually the strategy formulation. You will come out with a document that is defensible, that is evidence-based, that clearly shows to people in a developmental and logical fashion what should be done, why it should be done. That, in my mind, is what an eHealth strategy should be doing to people. And as I emphasized at the beginning, it's only when you have your own eHealth strategy that you are in charge of your future destiny, both in terms of what happens internally and in terms of what happens externally. Think about Haiti, for example. I was there last year a couple of times trying to convince the government to invoke eHealth strategy. They, in actual fact, had so many NGOs that were coming into the country, and we surveyed them. They were doing eHealth in one fashion or another, but they were unknown to the government, they were unknown to one another, and so they were wasting a great deal of time, effort, and money. If they had been coordinated, if the government had actually had in place their own eHealth strategy, and they could have said to NGOs, if you align with our strategy, you are welcome. If you do not align with our strategy, no thank you, not at this time. Then I think much greater success would have been seen. And this type of thing, it's not just Haiti, this type of thing happens across the world. In the next slide, I just want to briefly touch on policy. This is one of my favorite diagrams, despite the fact it's a bit hazy. People often have tried to put policy in place before they had their strategy. And I have to question the logic. If you don't know where you're going or why you want to go there, how on earth are you going to establish the right policy to facilitate that? So for me, the strategy comes first. The strategy is the railway line. eHealth is the train going along that line. But you have to obviously know your destination and the direction you're going to take in order to lay that railway line. That is your strategy. And policy is simply there to grease the wheels and to facilitate the process by which that can be achieved. And in the next slide, this is that diagram again, and I just want to forget about the actual content. I just want to emphasize to people that by getting an eHealth strategy together, you are going to have the evidence-based, locally needs-based, transparent and defensible document you require. And it's much better to spend fewer dollars up front in the organizational phase, developing the strategy, than it is to perhaps waste billions of dollars, as we have seen in other countries, in rushing forward and implementing something just so it looks as though you're doing something for the country. I think that is a complete waste of time, effort, and money. And in the next slide, this is what I spoke about before. If we can have facility-level eHealth strategy aligned with national eHealth strategy, and external agencies can come in and support that as well, we will ultimately develop a regional-level eHealth strategy that will help not just a country, but a region move forward as far as implementing the correct eHealth solutions. In the next slide. So is this easy? No, but it's very important. And if you just go forward. So this is what I always emphasize to people. What you're doing now, and I apologize, that's an old slide, knows I'm going to Pakistan next week, and I'm going to be talking to them about strategy as well. Whatever country you're talking about, you are laying the foundation now for many, many years to come. We're spending so much money on eHealth, you cannot just simply say, well, okay, no, that didn't work, let's try something else. You have to get it right first time. So if you carry on. There we go. Take the time to do it right and do it right first time. That is becoming one of my mantras that I try to get people to listen to. And the next slide. So here we are then. eHealth is a train. It's already left the station. We know that. But even if you're on board, how do you know you're headed in the right direction if you don't have your eHealth strategy in place? So in the next slide, thanks very much indeed, everybody. If you want to ask questions now, I'd be delighted to take them, or if you want to contact me again in the future, then you have my email address in the next slide. Alia. Can you go on to the next slide there, Leah? So Leah, are you there? You're going to take over now and see if there are any questions?
Richard.
Hi there, Alvin.
I think that I'm agency ways on implementing an eHealth strategy.
Okay, thank you, Richard. That was very interesting. We've seen some comments already and questions from the chat, many of them coming from me, of course. But we'll prioritize those that came from other people. Any questions? You can click on the raise hand icon, or you can type it in the chat window. There was a question from Vince earlier about how about the eHealth strategy versus the 2015 ASEAN harmonization. How do we deal with this inter-country thing when it comes to a regional or an inter-country eHealth strategy? Rich, you want to try that? Over.
No, I'm going to leave that entirely in your hands. I'm going to have to go and look at that. In actual fact, I didn't realize that ASEAN had its own eHealth strategy. But I think that's depending upon how it's phrased, that may be a little ambitious because once again, I suppose, does it come from the top down or does it come from the bottom up? And in this particular situation, because I think, healthcare is still very much a sovereign issue for each country, I think we have to sort out what's happening in the countries first and then look for ways that we can support one another and harmonize our efforts within a regional fashion. So that may, in actual fact, be getting ahead of itself a little. But I reserve the right to change my opinion once I've actually read that document. And if you have that and can send it on to me, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, we'll ask Vince to send that over. I think the context here is about in 2015, the ASEAN will allow cross-border practice of medicine and drug trade, the legal drug trade. And so a Filipino doctor could practice in Cambodia, a Cambodian doctor could practice in Malaysia, so forth and so on.
Okay, well, once again, cautionary, but I think that's ideal because I've often spoken about global eHealth policy and the fact that because we create this in our own countries, oftentimes we forget about the appropriate policy we need to allow true global eHealth to take place, or global eHealth, as I call it in that context. But that's more of a policy issue, but I'm delighted to hear that. That's great.
Dr. Fazila from Malaysia. When we say strategy, it always gives a picture of the final destination. Can we have short-term strategies aligned with health priorities? Over.
Well, if you've developed your strategy correctly, you will have seen that indeed there are certain steps you need to take along the way. So I would call those more tactics. I think there's only one strategy, and that's the, if you will, the ultimate goal. But there are certain tactics that you'll have to put in place in order to be able to reach that goal. And so, once again, although sadly, as I say, the term strategy is very much overused, I would prefer to keep strategy as the golden egg, and the path that we pursue to get there to be individual tactics along the way. But yes, in essence, you're right. It's impossible to achieve the end goal all at once, and so there will be stages, and this can be a part of the strategy. There will be stages to the development process that will be needed in any particular country.
So would you say, Richard, that it would be preferable to have a big picture perspective and then cut it up into short-term packages that, when done correctly, would lead you into completing the big picture, rather than?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm trying to say here. How do you eat an elephant? Well, it's one piece at a time. And that's what I hope, or I had hoped I had put across. As you develop your strategy, there will be the need for steps and stages in that strategy to accomplish the goal. So yes, it will naturally flow from the strategy how you achieve it.
You know what? I'm surprised with what you mentioned about Canada not having a strategy. So all this time, I thought I thought InfoWay was the strategy, or I mean, InfoWay was at the center of the eHealth strategy or something like that. Could you clarify what you meant by that? I'm getting disillusioned. Over.
No, I will perhaps get into trouble for this, but it's always been my opinion. InfoWay was created, in actual fact, if you go back historically, it was created for the sole purpose of implementing a cross-Canada electronic health record. Belatedly, it recognized that there was something called telehealth, and perhaps other things as well. And it never changed its mandate, although it absorbed those other components and did fund those components as time went by. But still, its overarching goal is achieving the interoperable Canada-wide electronic health record, although in actual fact what it is now is provincial and territorial electronic health records that are interoperable. But nowhere is there one document that is being developed as an eHealth strategy. There is not one document that, as I've laid out and described here, shows where Canada wants to go and why it wants to go there, and doing a solid health needs assessment along the way. There are many documents that collectively Canada Health InfoWay will put my way and say, well, here is our strategy, but it's not. I suppose what was the? It's interwoven. It may make a strategy, but it's not one document and it's not clear. It's a hodgepodge at this point in time.
About the Kenya eHealth strategy. So I have two questions related to that. You listed 8 steps. Did they go through those steps, and who are the stakeholders that you have to loop in as you go through those 8 steps? And did Kenya do it? Over.
Okay, the 8 steps that we're recommending. Yeah, if you read in the paper, there are certain things that we speak about. In other words, it is necessary to involve a large number of people, because and I'm not just talking the government here. There are great examples that I have of some countries that I know, I will not mention at this particular point in time, who have developed their own eHealth strategy, both eHealth and telehealth, and yet they haven't spoken to vendors. They haven't spoken to users. It's all government. That's not the right way to do it. You have to involve the vendor community, the research community, somehow find a way to also understand the needs of the users so that everybody is on board. So once this strategy is created, as I say, it's defensible, and therefore people cannot just pull it down. It's something that everybody has bought into, understands the logic of what options there were and why you chose the ones you did. Too complex, too costly, can't do it just now. These ones seem to be reasonable, both in terms of cost and complexity, and will have a high impact. Let's go for those. once you have that kind of, and this is very simplistic, and I know I'm leaving politics out of it, but once you have that kind of strong evidence, it becomes difficult for people to argue against it.
Alignment. And finally, alignment with global eHealth strategy. In your opinion, how would that be?
I'm sorry, Alvin, you were disconnected there for a moment. Can you repeat that?
Yes, that's the question on the chat window from Dr. Fazila.
Okay.
You mentioned about alignment and final alignment with the global eHealth strategy. Can you elaborate more about that? Over.
Okay. Well, as I said at the beginning, I'm a foolish believer in this thing called global eHealth. In other words, and it sounds as though AeHIN is taking a great leap forward, we cannot have global eHealth unless we can actually have clinicians in one country facilitating and supporting patients in another country. That is a very important first step. So I think that kind of thing is going to allow us to, in the end, create this fictitious concept called global eHealth. At this point in time, everything tends to be country-focused, parochial, intra-jurisdictional. And so my dream is, once we have, I suppose a country will have its national eHealth strategy, accepting, remember, that we spoke about differential diagnosis, and so there will be different foci in different parts of the country. Because of that, the facilities will be able to move forward in developing their own eHealth strategy, how they will actually bring that to pass in their own local area. And that will align naturally with the national eHealth strategy. And what global eHealth ultimately will be is when we have the ability for one country, in the fashion in which it's created, it's addressing its own eHealth needs, but it also has the capacity and the desire to help other countries move forward and develop and mature their own eHealth solutions as well. Sometimes, well, let's use a practical example here. If we look at South Africa, well, any developing country, the number of clinicians, particularly in some specialties, is very, very, very poor. And so what those countries could perhaps most benefit from as they develop their own capacity, both in terms of health capacity and eHealth capacity, they could most benefit from other countries providing clinical support. In other words, being able to connect with patients in their own country and to provide the care that those patients need. It's not that we want north-south, as it likely this could happen, south-south. And it's not a matter of a business opportunity in my mind. It's a global public good. In other words, we should be offering this kind of service so that the pressure is taken off some countries as they develop their own capacity. Ultimately, they'll be able to take on the responsibility themselves. But in my mind, the alignment comes from the fact that there are certain specialties in one country that can facilitate support in another country, and it's allowed, it's permitted because of the interjurisdictional policy that is in place. I hope that explained it.
We have 70 participants in Cambodia. Can you believe that? And that's behind the machine of Dr. Sambat. And his question is there an endpoint for eHealth? Is it a guide? Over.
Is it a guide? eHealth is just a tool, and I don't think we should ever forget that. And is there an endpoint? Not really. And this is one of the things that concerns me. I sometimes feel, and this is also a reason why I think a strategy helps, I sometimes feel that we are currently allowing the technological imperative to get the better of us. In other words, we rush forward, mHealth comes online, ooh, that's good, let's do that. Ooh, social media, well, that's neat, let's try that. We're not giving ourselves sufficient time to look back on what solid and successful eHealth initiatives are, and to implement those to the benefit of the population of a country. We're still rushing ahead and trying new things. I feel sometimes that we need to take pause, look at what works, implement those, and then start, once we have a little bit of solid success, if you will, then start looking at other more innovative ways to achieve things. But I'm afraid, no, there is no endpoint for eHealth, because eHealth is just the use of technology, and technology changes. But again, I will emphasize, I think that really speaks to the need for an eHealth strategy, so we don't get carried away by using the latest and greatest. We focus on what will work.
All right, Richard, last two questions. From Vince, Philippines. Follow-up question on stakeholder engagement. What will be the most important role of government in strategy development? Will it be the lead, or will it be mainly focused as implementer, regulatory? Over.
I think it has to be as lead, because that's how countries function. But my concern is, I'm not sure if governments are able to take on that role, because they tend to be very insular. And I'm not speaking about any particular country here. From what I've seen, it's almost across the board. It's just the way governments are. So somehow they have to be the facilitator for the process, and recognize it, not to be alarmed, I suppose, by inviting other people in and inviting other opinions. They have to, in the end, they are the ones who typically, and once again, I know there's arguments pros and cons here as well, depending upon the country, typically they are the implementer, and they are somehow going to be responsible for finding the funding to facilitate the process, private or otherwise. So I think they have to be in control, but they have to be open-minded and to recognize the fact that they need the opinion and the insight and the skills and the knowledge from many other stakeholders in order to develop an eHealth strategy that will actually work.
I would like to raise the issue of confidentiality among stakeholders. It's often a gray area when discussing or sharing information, for example, among HIV/AIDS patients. Could you give your insights about this? Over.
Oh, this is a tremendously difficult area, and I think sometimes it may have to have a political solution. The main reason why people fear information about, as you mentioned, their HIV/AIDS, fear information getting out, is because they will then become subject to unfair treatment. They might be shunned if it becomes known that they are HIV positive. They might, depending upon, let's think of other situations in the US many years ago. We were talking about genetic testing, which is going to become very common shortly. And you may be refused insurance, life insurance or disability insurance, or you may not be allowed to be employed because of something. All of these things are against human rights. And yet, on the one hand, we always say we support human rights. So I think, I sometimes fear that we're trying to find a technological solution, in other words, to privacy and confidentiality, that may not be appropriate. We have to tackle it in other ways. And those ways are probably thinking about human rights and policy that enshrines those rights. Because if all of a sudden there's no embarrassment about having any particular diagnosis, then there's no need for confidentiality. This is a brave thing for me to say, and perhaps a foolish thing, but I hope people will understand the gist of what I'm trying to say here. Once that is taken away, then there's no reason for things to be held in such confidentiality. Now, having said that, of course, then you don't want anybody and everybody having access to your health record, so there has to be some control. But I think from some of the suggestions and solutions that have been proposed for electronic health records, for example, where for example, in the case that I always give, I'm trained as a clinical and forensic toxicologist. Yet in actual fact, I would not be allowed to have access to somebody's electronic health record because I'm not recognized as a professional, which I find ironic, but there we go. And when it comes to thinking about toxicology, I'm sorry, I have to have full access to a patient's record in order to understand what exposures they may have had in the past, to what extent they, well, it's Latin, liberation, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion. You have to understand the exposure of potential poisons and their concentration at any given point in time. And those facts could be hidden anywhere in somebody's medical record. So here I am. I cannot provide my skill and my experience to physicians through an electronic health record because I'm not given permission. And, you know, there are many, many ironies and stupidities in my mind by, as I say, trying to find a technological solution to this problem. And I don't believe it's a technological issue. We have to tackle it in other ways.
All right. Any more questions? Just raise your hand.
Well, if I may, I've been looking at the chat here, and I just want to say to everybody, thanks very much indeed. These are tremendous questions and some comments in actual fact that have been made by people. So I think this is great. In actual fact, this is good feedback for me. And I'm pleased that it seems to stimulate some interest amongst people. Thank you very much indeed.
All right, Aliyah, could you wrap up, please? We have our traditional picture taking.
Thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Richard Scott. We'll be thoroughly posting all the inputs that were in this meeting to our website and to our social media account. So for us to wrap up this meeting, I hope you have your video cam with you. Please turn on your webcam, and we will be documenting your virtual presence in this AeHIN Hour. On my signal, hello?
In actual fact, I think the camera on.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying again now, seeing if it will come on this time, but I tried.
We can see a green screen on your left.
Oh, I see you, and I see a little green blob on the bottom right-hand side. Hi there. Oh, you can see me. Excellent. I see Alvin.
Hi.
Hi there. How you doing? I didn't see my little picture in the picture there. So, can you actually see me?
You can only see a green screen.
You are a green person. Richard has a lot of hair.
That's because I'm an alien. What can I say?
Richard is from Mars.
So I can see now webcam on from our friends in Malaysia, in Taiwan, in the Philippines, in Cambodia. I also have one in Luna from Bangladesh.
Ulaanbaatar. Alvin is in Ulaanbaatar.
Right there. Also Vince. Okay. We will have 5 shots to take because I have to move the screen to the next side so we can capture others. Okay, so
I have a picture of Richard.
That'll do. Cardboard replica.
I'll print screen our AeHIN Hour session. So smile, 1, 2, 3. Then I got that one. We still have 3 more. I hope that would be okay for you now.
Just keep smiling. It's our souvenir picture.
Yes, and we should tell our counterparts that we have this AeHIN Hour activity so that everyone and others will come. So once more, let me take that. Okay. So I've already got the photos from Malaysia, from Taiwan, from Fatima and Kenneth. Let's have others from the second batch.
Don't forget Richard's green background.
So from the next batch, Dr. From Taiwan, Cambodia, and Luna, and Dr. Pradeep from Sri Lanka. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, we have that.
It's a nice smile, Richard.
Thank you. If you go to my Skype,
I can imagine it in my mind how you look like. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much, Richard, for sharing your time and expertise. We look forward to having you in our future AeHIN Hours again.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.